Hola, hola everyone. Buenos días o tardes ya. Depends on what time you're listening to our episode. We're very happy to have you back on this Señora Power trip. This is Sophia.
This is Gabby.
And this is Sonia.
And this is the story of one of our most radical señoras. She was arrested more than 4 times, although we're only going to tell you about 4 of them. And she also has a 1,000-page FBI file. She is Señora Yolanda Garza Birdwell, and this is her story. A ti te dedico mis versos, mi ser, mis victorias. A ti mi respeto, señora, señora, señora. So today we're going to be talking about one of the most infamous radicals in Chicana circles. She was hanging out with a lot of our other señoras like Mamie Garcia and Maria Jimenez in Houston. And I think she had correspondence with some of our LA señoras, or at least she was mentioned in some of the señora archives that we visited in LA. She has had multiple articles written about her, and she has been interviewed many, many times. Some interviews that you can look up online are by Ernesto Valdez for the Houston Oral History Project, and a YouTube video that she has with Jesus Medel, the founder of the Museo Guadalupe Aztlán, also in Houston. And as well, we also spoke with her back in October of 2024, so we'll be bringing you some of the quotes from that interview. And as you can tell, Señora Yolanda's story is a story that we've heard many times. It's about community building. It's about advocating for marginalized groups. It's about working across geographies with other señoras and with other coalitional groups. All of our señoras have done this. So why is Yolanda such a suspicious señora? Why was she arrested? Why was the FBI looking into her business? We'll tell you that story in a second. But first, it's important to talk about Yolanda's earlier life before she came into her political consciousness and her long history of activism, right? So before, we know her as Yolanda Garza Birdwell, but before she was Yolanda Garza Bermea. That's her given name, her family name. She describes her early life in Tamaulipas. That's where her family is from. So her family fled to Texas during the Mexican Revolution. They had been there for a while, but then the Great Depression hit and they went back to Mexico. But Yolanda had always had the idea of having a city life. She liked the idea of being in a city. So at some point during her teenage years, she decides to move to her aunt's house in Houston. And I think that at some point we have to do like a tia episode because that's a particular kind of señora. But in any case, Yolanda moved in with her tia and she ended up getting married to a Mr. Rangel. But it turns out he was a very traditional man. She describes him as an abusive man. So Yolanda, took her power and decided to leave him at some point. I think the full story there is that he got a job somewhere else, left her right after she's had their kid. And he's like, all right, I have a job. See ya. And so he leaves and she decides to leave him and she finally gets divorced after some time. But remember, a divorced woman in the 60s, that's a particular kind of woman with a particular kind of negative connotation to it. She didn't care though. She doesn't care. She's just happy to not be with this abusive man anymore. So once she, becomes a single mom, once again, she starts to study business in 1961 at Dunham Business School in Houston. She's a working single mom. She was very aware of classism, racism, sexism, especially through labor segregation practices. So in this moment of being a working single mom is when she kind of like comes into her political consciousness. She starts to see all of these kind of like different power imbalances around her life, right? And because she has to make a living somehow, she's working at a laundry service. And that's where she meets Walter, or I guess that's where Walter meets her, because that's important. That's an important clarification in this story. So she's working at a laundry place on Houston's Navigation Street. And Walter, this nondescript white man from Missouri, shows up to do his laundry, right? They meet. It's kind of like an immediate love story is how she describes it. Like immediately they see each other and they decide this is something I want to pursue. However, an important thing to keep in mind about Walter is that he is in Texas because he is in the army, all right? He had been recruited from Missouri to gather intelligence about Mexican-American groups in the Texas area, especially in relation to civil rights and Chicano movements. So he was an army spy, active in 1965 and 1966, and his specific assignment at the University of Texas in Austin was to target the organization called Students for Democratic Society. So he was there in his official capacity as army spy to figure out what kind of democratic society these dangerous students are trying to build and organize and put together, right? It's important to say, too, that he is not the only spy who is doing this thing at this moment in time. In later interviews, Yolanda recognizes that for every 4 people in the movement, at least one of them was either FBI or CIA. This should not come as a big surprise for many of us because remember, this is the time of COINTELPRO. If you don't know what COINTELPRO is, this is the time to look it up and become familiar with that story. The Counterintelligence Program was an FBI program designed to target and surveil, first of all, communists. It was began in 1956 to kind of monitor the activity after the Cuban Revolution, right? The FBI wanted to make sure that none of the Cuban communist subversives were making their way into these student organizations, right? So it first started as a way to surveil communists, but then it expanded to surveil civil rights activists, precisely because a lot of them were calling for communist, socialist kind of like realignments to the broader system, right? Now, COINTELPRO used to be a top secret project that no one had heard about. There were rumors, as Yolanda was aware of these rumors about spies, about infiltrators, et cetera. But it was kept top secret until the project was finalized and required to made public. A lot of FBI records are required to be made public after the program has ended, right? This is very different to what's going on today, right? There's a very clear and blatant targeting of people who are speaking out against genocide, people who are attending pro-Palestinian rallies and protests and actions, right? A lot of these people have been essentially kidnapped by the state. They have been revoked of their legal status without due process. And all of this just takes us back to that moment of surveillance, to that moment of ignoring human rights, especially around civil rights activism. So again, as you're listening to this episode, try to think of all of the things that were happening in Yolanda's time and how they have a particular kind of repetition in our time today. And we'll say more about that as the episode goes on. So back to Walter, right? Walter is kind of adjacent to this COINTELPRO program as an army spy, right? But he meets Yolanda at the laundry service, right? As an active duty member of the army, Walter couldn't marry non-citizens. So at some point, Walter was faced with this easy choice. Do you want to keep your position as an army spy? Or do you want to quit the army and marry Yolanda? So what does he do? He goes on to serve as a delivery person for the USPS. He's like, bye army, peace out. I don't want to be an army spy anymore. It's an easy choice for him. The army is just a job that he accepted as a young guy. And again, important to remember that, the army, border patrol, the police department, all of these surveillance agencies do their main recruiting from high schools. And for a high schooler, you're 18 years old, you can't do very many things in the world, but you can drive a Camaro and have a full-time job with full benefits. It's an enticing choice. But Walter and Yolanda's story make clear that it's an easy choice to quit that kind of job. And, just become a delivery person. Everyone needs mail. In any case, though, because of this easy choice, because he gives up this kind of like career choice for to be with Yolanda, they were both interested in politics. They were both kind of like became radicalized upon MLK's assassination in Atlanta, which itself was following the earlier assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. They were both very interested in politics. And so after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968 in Atlanta, which itself followed the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, and which kind of like precedes the assassination of Chicano journalist Ruben Salazar in 1970. So this is a moment of danger, of risk when it comes to being an activist, right? But Yolanda and Walter attended a rally in 1968 where Gregorio Salazar, a mayor activist in Houston who was involved with MAYO, the Mexican American Youth Organization. We've talked about MAYO before. He was associated with the Raza Unida party, and he was one of the main organizers for the Venceremos Brigade. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. But first of all, I want to hear from you all. In terms of this, I often think that this is my favorite love story in Señora Power, right? Walter and Yolanda. So what do y'all think is the role of romance in Señora activism?
I absolutely love this question. I also love this love story. A bit of a confession is I'm an enemies to lovers fan, and I love this idea that Walter came in as an enemy of sorts, right, to the organizing work that she's doing, and then they connected on a level that is so far removed from this like bureaucratic like career position, right? And as you were speaking, it was reminding me of Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic essay, which is a 1978 speech that she gave. And she talks about how the erotic sexuality, sexual connection is so incredibly important for movements, marginalized communities, and their organizing, because it's a sort of electrifying feeling between people that can connect you in a way that mobilizes, in a way that makes you want to do something for someone. So love, sex, erotic can become something that the police state, the bureaucracy, people who have power and control actually cannot touch. And it has really become foundational in so many different ways to joy, to living beyond just like going to work, doing the things, right? It kind of makes like life textured and beautiful. And I have more to say, but I think that it reminds me of Audre Lorde and the way that romance and erotic and sexuality becomes just so important to working to make life better for the people that you love, that you're attracted to. It doesn't even have to be like, a heterosexual romantic relationship. Like this can happen like between friends, right?
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I love this story. First of all, I think that this should be made into one, a romance novel, two, like a series of films, maybe Netflix, perhaps. I don't know. Do we think Netflix will run it? They might. Yeah. So anyway, this is my pitch to do like a YouTube web series, like 2012 style, of this story. I think that this idea of love and activism is something that goes beyond like strategy. Of course, it can be like, alongside it, but I think that's why it's so cool. But I also want to do a nod to the idea that, okay, so I think the romance we're talking about is this kind of radical romance, like this idea of like resisting through human connection. And in fact, in a way, we see that, Walter, I think, could go beyond his situation because he had someone else to care about that symbolized the thing that he was weirdly like fighting against at first, right? And then he like it helped him to change his perspective. And I think that's the really true key part about love, is that it helps you to be just truly deeply empathetic, and so you can actually like experience somebody else's reality without like really planning to, right? But I also want to say that this romance is very different from what we've talked about in the past of like just being married to somebody, or like being young and feeling like you have to marry someone, or like being in a situation that you feel like you can't leave because you love that person. And I think that I want to like put that out there, because I don't want people to think that we're just trying to highlight like a fairy tale love story and not be empathetic or understanding about the other señoras that we've seen, and even Yolanda, like, right, who have had to go through relationships where maybe they started out really believing that they loved that person, and that love wasn't met halfway. And so I think that what's remarkable about Walter and Yolanda's story is that they both met each other halfway. And I think that's also true in organizing, in the resistance, right? You have to meet the people on your side halfway. You have to like all be holding each other up. And I think it's something that's true in romantic relationships is like, you know, it's not always going to be 50-50. Sometimes it's 90-10 or whatever. And that's also true in organizing. It's like, you know, you have to hold each other up. And part of that is because you're working towards something larger than yourselves. And that's true in a relationship too. Like you both have this love that's larger than yourselves, I think, and better together than apart.
That was amazing responses. Thank you both, because you're both bringing up very important points that continue to be important for Yolanda's life and activism. This notion of like the erotic, the role of sex and sexuality, pleasure, joy, romance, love in all of this like radical work, and as well as the compromise.
I realized that, I don't know if you have this later on in your script, that she told us to find a lover. Are we talking about this?
It's not later on in the script. Do you want to reference it real quick?
Yeah. I think the reason I want to reference it is because she herself brought this up as a theme. Like that, I just want people to know that we're not like reading this in because like she has a great love story, which she does, but also because Yolanda told us that it is very good in resistance in general just to find a lover, right? But she also really meant it like to find someone you can rely on truly, not in a like prescriptive way, but just like, you know, be in love.
Be in like revolutionary love kind of thing. Sonia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, only just to say it was a really bright spot of that interview. So I'm glad that Gabby remembered to bring it up, because she went through, you're going to keep going, but like the things that she went through are so intense and like deeply traumatic. And she continues to be just this incredibly vivacious and like loud and extroverted, and like she's not scared to say what she feels. And when she says this, it almost took us off guard, I think, when she was like, and also make sure you have a lover, you know. And I just remember being like, what? But also just like so thrilled by it. I think it brought us joy to even hear her say that. So yeah, I'm glad that Gabby brought that up.
It's great, and it kind of like validates what we've been saying about señoras, right? Like the traditional way of understanding a señora is a married woman. And even though Yolanda was very much married, very much in love, very much had a lover, her señora activism it's mixed up with that kind of like love story, right? Because they were both so active and they were both so trustful of each other to rely on each other in these very dangerous ways. Because remember, she was arrested a whole bunch of times, and they both were, right? They were both being surveilled. So I think it was a great moment to hear her say that, like, get a lover not because it's the traditional thing to do, but because you're going to need support in this kind of work. So I also appreciated that moment. And like I said, it's bringing us back to this idea of like the erotic, pleasure, love, all of the different forms and shapes that love can take. And also the notion of like compromise, right? Even if you are very much in love, even if you share this thing together, there's going to be a give and take. Even if you have the broader good of the community in mind, an organization is going to have to be about like compromise in terms of how you provide for that community in a way that makes sense to everyone. And that's what Yolanda's story helped us figure out, right? So on this theme of like the erotic, on this theme of compromise, on this theme of difference. So let's talk for a second about the 1971 Conferencia de Mujeres por la Raza. It took place in Houston in the YWCA of Magnolia Park. We've mentioned this conference in our podcast before. A lot of our señoras were there. Yolanda was one of the señoras who were there. So in her retelling of this 1971 conference, and this is the moment that earns her the title of like infamous radical in specifically Chicana circles, right? And she's very happy about this title. She is happy to be the radical. She's happy to be pointed out as someone who is doing something different, right? So the first thing she does for this conference is that she collaborates with another Houston señora, Gloria Guardiola. We haven't talked about her, but she was also very active in Houston at the time. Together, they write a pamphlet, which was illustrated by Leo Tanguma. If you're a Houstonian, if you know anything about Houston, this name might sound familiar. You're probably going to know Tanguma's mural titled The Rebirth of Our Nationality, which is now on Canal Street, painted on what is now Houston Police Department station. Very interesting site. So I encourage you to Google it, check it out, go there in person, etc. But Leo Tanguma was the one who illustrated this pamphlet, and the title of the pamphlet was La Mujer, Destrucción de Mitos, Formación y Práctica del Pensamiento Libre. So these two words are super important for Yolanda's activism, the formation and the practice of free thought. The pamphlet itself was an intersectional text. That means it's looking at racism, economics, labor practices, politics from all sorts of different angles as they pertain to women specifically, as they pertain to the community in general, right? So that's what the pamphlet is about. They kind of like shared it around the conference. And then they staged a workshop around the pamphlet and around the information that was in the pamphlet. This workshop talked not only about, second wave feminism in terms of sexual liberation, in terms of the right to sex and the right to pleasure for women, consensual pleasure, etc. But also she was primarily focused on sharing important information in a very blunt way. So she is talking, the workshop was talking about questions of incest, questions of infidelity. You don't have to put up with your cheating husband anymore, or cheating partner, as the case might be. She talked about sexual abuse, especially towards younger people, towards minors, especially around the church and family spaces, which were supposed to be safe spaces, but that's not always the case. Specifically towards the women audience, she was sharing a lot of information around consent. What does it mean to actually consent to a sexual relationship? What does it mean to not consent? And when should that be respected? The answer is always, right? But that's not kind of like the discourse in the 1970s. And specifically for Yolanda, she was very focused on sharing information about pregnancy. How do people become pregnant? What to do when you're pregnant? What to do when you're pregnant and don't want to be pregnant, etc., etc. Needless to say, even today, this kind of pamphlet and workshop would ruffle some feathers, I guess. And in that moment, in that 1971 moment, a lot of people had very harsh and very critical things to say about this workshop. It was divisive. It was stalling the broader Chicano movement by only focusing on women issues. It was vulgar because it was talking about sex. How dare you, But she's proud of this. She's proud of saying the quiet part out loud. In that interview with Jesus Medel, she says, "This is what happens when you have a community that has been silenced for a long time. We're going to be disorganized." And she's not saying we're not going to see eye to eye. She's not saying we're not going to have the same point of view. She's going to saying there's not going to be any organization to work things out. So what she's focused on, again, formación y práctica del pensamiento libre. She is not saying we all have to think the same way. She's saying we need information and we need organization. From the same conference, she remembers another one of our Señoras, Maria Jimenez, and she remembers the Chicanas from California being kind of like the primary dissenters. They didn't see a straight up relationship to the work that they were doing in California and the kind of work that Yolanda and Gloria were proposing here. And I'll give you all space to respond to the conference in a second, but I'll just take you through some of her other actions that she was doing at the time in the early 70s around Houston. So she was a part of what she calls Barrio MAYO. So MAYO, remember, Mexican American Youth Organization. Remember, Maria Jimenez was very involved with college MAYO, school MAYO. But Yolanda was not so much in the schools. She does activism around school boards and education, but she's mostly focused on the community itself, right? So once her and Walter attend this talk by Gregorio Salazar, they become very interested in the Chicano movement and they want to become a part of this particular organization, MAYO. Walter wasn't trusted in these circles for obvious reasons, right? What is this random white guy doing here? Wasn't he an army spy at some point? Like, we don't want this person around. Yolanda did not have the same kind of issue. She showed up, she started doing the work, and she very quickly became a highly trusted person among these circles because she was willing to step up, to take an advocacy role, etc., and to speak up for the community. So very quickly she becomes, along with Gregorio, the kind of like the main organizers for Barrio MAYO in Houston. This marks the first time that Yolanda is arrested. She points out that a teacher in one of the schools in Houston was being racist, names her, like calls her out by name, gets her fired. Teacher then sues Yolanda for preventing her from making a living. Judge sides with this teacher and arrests Yolanda because she's preventing people from making a living. Yolanda's very proud of this one. So, she continues to work on her activism. And she points out that, Barrio MAYO was considered to be more radical than other MAYO chapters. In the interview with Ernesto Valdez, Yolanda says, I don't know, we felt that we needed to raise questions that other people could not ask for whatever reason. So she's willing to put herself in that position of risk, if and only if, to ask the questions, to have the conversations, to spread the information, right? So even though she was highly active with MAYO and everything, and, her and Gregorio were the main kind of organizers, in 1971, Gregorio says, you know what, I'm gay. And by the way, I'm also a communist. And he's not just sharing his positionality just because, but he's sharing it because he says, in this moment in time, my personal subject position would bring negative and unwanted attention to this organization. So I would rather just step back and let the organization continue with its work. So here we're back again to that notion of like compromise, right? Like if you know that something is not going to be good for the organization, it's better to step down he was still active, right? He was doing things behind the scenes, but he was not the face anymore. Throughout their work with MAYO, before he left MAYO, what he and Yolanda were doing was focusing on helping low-income families from Segundo Barrio, advocating for educational reform and the students' right to protest. In fact, in 1970, MAYO organized a series of student walkouts in Segundo Barrio, similar to the East LA walkouts 2 years prior in 1968. They had 13 demands that had to do with segregation, with corporal punishment and other kinds of humiliation practices. Remember, this is 1970, and corporal punishment was still allowed to happen if Mexican American people were speaking Spanish in the classroom, in the school, etc. They could not speak Spanish, otherwise they would be essentially beat up by teachers, right? So Yolanda was protesting this and people didn't like it. Beyond this, at the top of Yolanda's priorities was to get rid of the so-called pregnancy list that a couple of the schools around Houston had. These were lists with the names of all the young girls who had been kicked out of school for being pregnant. A thing that Yolanda calls a quote, vicious form of personal degradation. So she wanted to get rid of that pregnancy list, especially given the fact that a lot of people didn't know about consent, pregnancy, all of these other issues of misinformation for women, right, and for men. Of course, their demands were not met at all by the Houston Independent School District, so MAYO crashes the HISD meetings, pointing out the racism of not working with this organization, right? And this action at the school board, which was described as like highly disruptive and violent and riotous, all words that we've heard before, right? This is what initially puts her on that FBI watch list that I'll share with you in a second. So here's my question for you. After hearing all of this kind of like Yolanda's direct activism and the kinds of work that she had been doing. So we've talked about the conference before and about MAYO before in many different ways. But after hearing Yolanda's story, her work and her activism with these two, with this organization and with the Chicana movement in general, is there anything new about this moment in time, this organization, this conference that you learned via Yolanda's story? Did she teach you anything different about what we've been talking about here?
Yeah, I think Yolanda always, teaches me something new every time I've talked to her. I think it's interesting looking at MAYO, looking at the conference, as well as other organizations like LULAC, for example. We've been able to look at these things from so many different angles. And I think that it teaches you that no matter what, even if people were quote unquote on the same side in the same organization, they can have radically different experiences with the same organization. So specifically speaking to your question, Sophia, I got really into Maria Jimenez's story. And Maria was somebody who was at the conference and who also organized with MAYO for a time, as you pointed out, at University of Houston. However, Maria's experience was radically different from Yolanda's because of the kind of level where Maria herself says, she was, when she became a professor at U of H, she kind of entered into a different group, whether she liked it or not. So she was a university professor and she was organizing within MAYO for a time as kind of a college student or university professor with this idea of we have this theory, or we have this kind of theoretical view of revolutionary action. And Yolanda, you can see through the way that she tells her story about Barrio MAYO, which in and of itself was different from school MAYO, right? This on the ground kind of thing, she's talking about a sequence of actions, a sequence of events. When you look at Maria's kind of organizing, you also see the tangible good that she did the community. But there's also a lot of explanation kind of the theory behind it, or the strategy behind it. And here with Yolanda, there's a lot of explanation about if we did this, then this would happen tangibly for the people that we were looking at. And so I think it's really interesting because you see also that there's a lot of focus on sexual health and on this kind of very tangible thing of if we get rid of this list, then young women will have more possibilities in their lives. A lot of it is around the idea of good and bad, of women's sexuality, that it's women's sexuality is inherently bad. And whatever your moral take on that is, the reality, as we're seeing with Yolanda talking to us, Maria talked about this too, Alicia organized around this. It's not a coincidence that half or more of our señoras have organized around things that are tangential to this. When you limit women's sexuality, when you mark it as bad, that's actually harming over half of the population. Because you're not only harming women and their choices and their bodies and their health, but you're also limiting their children's access to education many times, their children's access to healthcare, because I think we've talked about before as well, people in government who are let's limit this freedom, do not also provide alternatives for funding your children's lives. If you are going to have these children and then be exiled from education, then how are you going to create a better path for your children and for yourself? And you see that in Alicia Escalante's story when she's advocating for welfare. But you also see this in Yolanda's story, because why was she fighting so hard against these lists? Like, why was she fighting so hard for women to know about their own bodies so that they could make a decision, so that they could escape this cycle of violence somehow? And I think that that's really remarkable, because it's a through line to a lot of women. And I can't believe that we have to keep saying this. But it's kind of like that meme of history sighs and repeats itself. Yeah.
I think that some things that I learned about these two organizations through Yolanda first begin with, and Gabby mentioned this already, but we've studied, we've read about the divisiveness of the Chicana conference. We went on like a little informal casual tour with Dr. Aranda, who we mentioned in the intro, where he walked us from the conference to where the women who walked out like went to the park nearby, right? So I feel like we had all of the different puzzle pieces, but Yolanda really put the entire picture together for us when she talked about the specific subject matter that led to the walkout. And I really appreciated her connections between Texas and California. Obviously, that's a connection that we are actively like investigating right now. And so when she was telling us, well, these California Chicanas were coming in and looking around at the Texas Chicanas, like, what are y'all even doing? You know, it's just, it adds another layer to what we've been already thinking about. And I think it helps us see the kind of broader picture of how difficult it was for Chicanas to organize, because there's so little about the Mexican American identity that you can really just like, it's like one solid thread, right? It's just so heterogeneous and so different, based on state, based on region, based on where your neighborhood is. And so it really is a sort of mirror of the Mexican American sort of fragmented, fractured experience. And when it comes to MAYO, I feel like, yeah, I learned so much from the Maria Jimenez in research that we did for MAYO. But what I loved about Yolanda is that she gave us a really important connection with queer solidarity, because she was so just emphatic and effusive about Gregorio. And we haven't talked a whole lot about like gay communities and their role in Señoras' lives, but it's so important to point out that he was such a fundamental, crucial person for the work that she was doing. And I think that oftentimes queer communities are the people who are on the front lines, who are putting their bodies literally on the line to mobilize, to get, resources to communities, to create, mutual aid funds, like different things like that. And so she really, I think, made an important connection to the way Chicanas were either queer themselves in doing that work or connecting to queer communities to continue fighting for resources beyond, we've been tracking the respect of Señoras, and so beyond just the respect that they were able to garner.
I think following up on Sonia's thread of queerness in the movement, so I don't think we've talked about this on this podcast, that it's actually important to note that LGBTQ individuals were both targeted by the government in the idea of like the lavender scare, of that lavender referring to all things LGBTQ, lavender scare kind of mirroring the idea of red scare. So the idea that all queer people were somehow communist, and that they were making a communist connection around the world, which honestly, vibes. I love that for us, but us, everyone. But I think that what I want to point out is that they had this antagonism from government structures, or from the institution, from the establishment, but also from the Communist Party. There was a time during which the Communist Party's stance was that being homosexual was being bourgeois, was like being a class traitor somehow. That you weren't actually homosexual, you were just trying to like go into a different social class or something. I'm actually like still flabbergasted from learning this and so therefore cannot provide much clarity on that. But what I can provide is that, as we all know, like systemic inequalities are actually ingrained in individuals. That's why they continue going on, because we ourselves don't understand our own biases and then we perpetuate them. This is also like just to say that if you have biases, because we all do, it's important to recognize them overtly to yourself in order for you to not perpetuate them. The first step is to recognize that you have biases. And I think that when you're talking about the movement in this time, there was so much pressure on everyone to like fight the government, to stay alive, to like keep organizing, to recruit people, that I don't know where the mental bandwidth was to also advocate for your own identity and your own self as a queer person during this time. But I just wanted to point out that Yolanda and Gregorio's friendship, that Gregorio standing up and saying, I'm gay, and then removing himself from MAYO to protect MAYO, I think was really, really brave and really beautiful. And I think this is kind of going back to the idea of where is romance in the revolution or in activism. Well, on one hand, there's this platonic like solidarity between Yolanda and Gregorio that I think is beautiful because it takes them beyond themselves. And I think on the other hand, also Gregorio in a way was standing up for romance as a radical thing, because him saying like, I love men, was a way to say like, F you to these like restrictions on his identity. And he was also communist. You know what I mean? So like, I think that's like important to note, is that, you know, gay people can be communists and that's okay.
Like, to bring it back full circle again too, not only was queer sexuality considered to be disruptive to the idea of la raza, but feminists were, right? Like, we've made this point before. And so it's why I think lesbian Latinas, lesbian Chicanas were so crucial to some of the work that has been done, because they were disrupting in two different ways. And so frequently the Chicano movement was trying to uphold a nuclear heterosexual idea of family in order to like actualize a future. And queer Mexican Americans, queer Latinas were doing the very important work of disrupting that oppressive hegemony, or that oppressive kind of top-down idea that ultimately fails. It doesn't actually end up in like the respect and the rights that they're attempting to gain, right? And so I just think like Latina lesbians is such an important point here to bring back too, and it's why romance is so important.
The story comes full circle with the romance, and actually going back to like the conversation around queerness and class. It's so interesting to hear that queer people in like traditional communism or whatever we want to call it, right? Like queerness is considered to be this like upper class kind of like action, where in Yolanda's context, one of the stories that she told us about was all of the different kinds of trips that MAYO would take as an organization to, you know, to become involved in other places, to this moment of like networking with other grassroots organizations. And she tells us, you know, we were poor, we didn't have money, so we would all sleep together in the same hotel room, or we would share beds with each other or whatever. And it was a practical decision to not have to spend so much money in order to like do this work. And people were mad about this. Chicanas were mad about this. Feminists were mad about this. Señoras were mad about this. Some of the MAYO people were mad about this. What do you mean you're all sleeping together, quote unquote, right? Like that makes us look bad. And they're like, no, we're just poor and making a practical economic decision. So it's important to say how that kind of like queerness, or that FU to traditional values, also has repercussions in other ways in which the group is conducting their activism in these very practical, non-traditional decisions, I guess, quote unquote. And I guess on that conversation about traveling together, taking trips together, right? When Yolanda was still a part of MAYO, because eventually she drops out of the group, but still with MAYO, Yolanda engages in a series of international trips specifically to socialist countries, including Cuba, Russia, China, and Palestine, which obviously increased the size of her FBI file, right? That has already been kind of like being put together. Walter was a spy. The army is very aware of what he's doing now in terms of his activism. Now they've pulled in Yolanda into the FBI file. She is now a subversive. So I'm not going to summarize the entire FBI file, but I'm going to read you a couple of like notable comments from the file. I think this is from the introduction to her file. And I'm getting this from a chapter that we'll link to in the episode notes, but it's, Chicanos in the FBI. It's a book about FBI surveillance of Chicano movements. So the introduction to the FBI file says things such as, and here I'm quoting, "The subject's volatile personality is fed by her revolutionary zeal based on her apparent feeling of inferiority because she was born in Mexico." End quote. Another quote says, and I'm paraphrasing here, she is, showing empathy toward Chicanos, but, quote, has never shown any empathy to the government of Mexico. Governments deserve empathy, I guess. While also, this is not the worst part of it, she's never shown empathy to the government of Mexico, but she admires the revolutionary doctrines coming out of Cuba. That's another reason why she's being surveilled. And then towards the end of this introductory kind of part to the file, the FBI says that they chose not to interrogate Yolanda directly because, quote, "It is believed no useful purpose would be served in view of subject's erratic and belligerent attitude toward established authority and her proclivity for making the news media, which would result in embarrassment for the Bureau." So we're all literary and analyst people, right? Help me read between the lines of these quotes. What is your literary analysis of these quotes? What can we say about the way that the FBI is kind of presenting Yolanda's file for review?
I think it's interesting that she's being described as like volatile. She's being described as erratic, belligerent. So all of these words are trying to place her in a kind of sphere of like maybe like poor mental health or poor choices. I think this is parallel to the idea of female hysteria that has always been used against women. And that, in case people don't know, like the idea of hysteria originally, in the 20th century was linked with like gynecological issues. So like, things happening in your uterus, like, and if you like are too much outside the home, you're gonna become hysterical. You're gonna have these like nervous mental health issues. I'll say like if women had mental health issues and were nervous in the 20th century, that was literally not because of their like uterus. That was probably because of their situation of being oppressed. But to come back to Yolanda, I'll say that these words of like volatile personality, erratic, belligerent attitude, they, to me, speak towards trying to invalidate her in a very gendered way. And the idea of like empathy, like you have to have empathy in this specific way is also something that's pretty gendered, because it's like the idea that like women are socialized and need to constantly be thinking about the emotions of others. But in this case, it's strangely weaponized on a governmental level, like on a nationalist level. Like they're right now equating like the idea of Chicanidad or Chicanos with the government of Mexico, right? So then it's kind of like, okay, so the government of Mexico is a governmental entity and Chicanos are, I think, paralleled here, like the idea of like having your own nation, which is what I think Chicanos at the time were arguing, like they wanted to have their own nation. But Yolanda was going beyond that idea. Having spoken to her, she's kind of like not a fan of the idea of like nationhood in a way. Complex, but I think that that's kind of what I see here is the idea that you have to have some sort of national affiliation, and Yolanda's national affiliation was Chicana, which makes her dangerous to the FBI.
I appreciate that reading a lot, and I want to linger too with the quote embarrassment. It could result in the embarrassment for the Bureau, because they're kind of telling on themselves, like, what are you doing that you're embarrassed about? Because this idea that she had a proclivity for making the news media says so much that they have to do what they're doing in secret, in silence, and not for like any kind of moral choice or any kind of ethical choice, but because if the news found out, they would be embarrassed, right? Not that other people would be angry, they'd be embarrassed. And I think it's important to make the connection too that what they're really upset with here is that she is questioning authority. They use the word established authority. And so I think that this is something that we are actively still working against right now. Like, this is a tension that I have with people in my own family, with some of my colleagues, right? Is that when there's an established authority like the FBI, like the US government, like Bureau of Trustees, there's so many different kinds of levels of authority. Even the Houston ISD, where she first got on the FBI watch list, right? It's this idea that what they say and what they think should go unquestioned because they have the power and the influence and supposedly the expertise to be making decisions for people. And thus the people should follow those decisions. And what they find particularly upsetting about Yolanda is that she questions their decisions. And she works hard to deconstruct or to kind of figure out what their strategies are and shift them. And they don't want her or anyone like her to be able to have that power over their decision making, which is why they don't want her to go to the news. So yeah, that's my reading into some of these things that they're saying about her.
I think it's also very telling. I wanted to say this earlier that here in Texas, Yolanda was arrested for bringing a lawsuit against a school teacher who had more power than her. And in California, like, Alicia was arrested for quote unquote, like, property damage to a church, right? But I think it's important to note that, like, in Texas during the same time, power was just asserted for literally no legal reason. Like, there was no real due process. And I think that's also important to understand the possibilities of organizing in Texas versus in California for some people during this time and always. And, if you assume that risk, that's a decision, but it's also, I don't know if, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I don't know if it's fair to say, like, when you organize in California, you have to do the exact same thing that you do in Texas, or like radicalism looks the same in both states, because again, like, and this is about like the power that's exerted, like the very slight reason that the FBI would follow someone, the very slight reason that a Mexican American woman would be arrested to like make her be quiet, so that's I think something notable.
Thank you both for those very great responses. I mean, there's so much else to say here about the FBI, about surveillance, about the extent of that surveillance, right? But I think, it's very telling that after writing 1,000 pages on this suspicious Señora, the FBI is like, we can't release this to the public because she's going to call the news, we're going to look like fools, and we're surveilling someone who has the radical agenda of establishing democracy. How would that make the FBI look, right? Badly is how it would make them look, and how they already look in many ways. But, but Yolanda was very aware of all of these things, and that's why she wasn't like super worried. I get the feeling that she had a sense that the surveillance was happening, but it wasn't confirmed until like way later when the records were made public. And I think this is one of the reasons why COINTELPRO as a program ended, right? Like, oh, we're surveilling our own people because they want to have democracy and collaboration, etc. And we're not finding the radical subversiveness or the danger to the nation that we were expecting to find, right? So anyways, Yolanda got pretty used to being surveilled in this way. Yolanda was very aware that you can't trust just anyone, right? You have to build that relationship, that intimacy, that platonic solidarity / romance kind of thing with the people, with the organizations, with the work itself, right? In a way. So I'll give you kind of like the final moment where Yolanda is in Houston, and then I'll talk a little bit about what her activism looks like now. So, you know, we're still in the 70s. This is the third time that Yolanda is arrested, and this is after she leaves MAYO. She has gone to China again, and she and Walter are now working at or owning, it's not clear to me, a bookstore on Elgin Street in Houston. And, you know, after this trip to China, she decides to begin stocking Chinese literature, especially in relation to books about communism, books about Mao Zedong, the founder of the Republic of China. So all of these very, again, subversive and radical kind of texts in her bookstore, right? So one day the bookstore is having an event around Mao's death in 1976. And as Yolanda tells it, the KKK shows up, the Ku Klux Klan shows up to the event to disrupt it, right? And they begin throwing rocks through the windows. They break a couple windows. They feel like they're in danger. So Walter, having been an army spy, takes out his gun and shoots at them. Does not shoot them, shoots at them so that they can stop destroying their bookstore. Obviously, the police shows up, and who gets arrested? Walter does, Yolanda does. But, you know, they get arrested for a bit. It's nothing new for them at this point. They're chill about it. They're not worried about it. So that's the third time she gets arrested. The fourth time she gets arrested, I believe, is a little bit more recent, and it has to do with after she leaves Houston. So after her many years of Houston-based activism, she and Walter decide to move to South Texas, specifically to be closer to family on the Mexican side of the border, right? She's like, I've done what we can here. We're now going to be closer to family. So they moved to South Texas. And in our interview with her, she was very, very clear about having an agenda for moving down to the Rio Grande Valley. And her agenda, as she describes it, is to offer free ESL classes, English as a second language classes. A lot of people from the border are Mexican nationals, have grown up in Mexico, Spanish is their primary language, etc. So she is providing her time and energy to give free English classes for people. She has, or part of her agenda is organizing a beach cleanup day. She doesn't like trash in the sand. She is concerned about the environment, so she gets her neighbors together to clean up the beach. She has been a member of her HOA for more than 40 years. She's interested in what's happening in her specific local community. She's very involved. And of course, in her years in the Rio Grande Valley, she's been volunteering with the Democratic Party, especially around issues of labor exploitation, because Mexican Americans are the primary labor force in this geography, and it's very easy to exploit people in vulnerable positions. So she is participating with the Democratic Party only in terms of labor issues. She would, in fact, be very mad at us if we did not clarify that she is not a member of the Democratic Party anymore. She was for a long, long time. However, in our interview in October of 2024, she told us that she has now fully divested from this kind of two-party system. She is not at all interested in choosing the best genocider. She prioritizes Palestinian liberation over everything else. In fact, she told us about the time that she visited the Gaza Strip in the 1980s. She says that it was horrific to see the occupation of Palestine. I promised Palestinian women that I will voice my opposition to occupation, and that is what I'm doing as long as I live. In fact, the fourth time that she is arrested, it was at a press conference where the city of Houston was hosting Benjamin Netanyahu. And she poses as a Mexican reporter one of the most dangerous jobs to have nowadays, by the way. But she poses as as a Mexican reporter. She tells us that she looked very bourgeois. She looked like a fancy lady, an important person, right, of the media. And during this press conference, she hand delivers a letter to Netanyahu telling him personally that he was not, in the 1980s, welcome in the city of Houston. So people didn't like that very much, so she gets arrested again. But nothing new at this point again. And she's very proud of that particular action, right? Especially nowadays. So she's very vocal about not supporting either of the two main parties that we have, and has been saying this for 50 years. Her main message is the current capitalist system doesn't work. We need to find alternatives that center people and the environment over any kind of profit. That is her main kind of preoccupation right now, to focus on people and not profit. She says that she became a little bit more daring in the RGV to divest from this two-party system because she has put in the work, essentially. She was very vocal about not voting for either of the two main parties. And she says that no one could be mad at her because she's very well respected in the community. Quote, "Nobody stopped me because I have already done a lot of service to the community for free. So I am respected in some areas. You see what I mean? It's different. It's difficult to beat me up when I have done so much for my community, period. That's it." That is Yolanda in a nutshell. She's going to do the thing. She's informed about the thing. She's educated about the thing. And she's not going to care about what you think about how she does the thing. Because her action, her participation is the most important part of it for her, right? So here's the final question that I have for you. Can we end this conversation, this episode, with a conversation about anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-genocide Señora strategies? How do we make sense? How do you respond to Yolanda's activism in the Rio Grande Valley as a Señora, as a widow, because Walter passed away in 2017, right? So she's been doing this work on her own for some years now. And just overall, as a respected member of this border community, what can we say about her later activism that is still going on today?
I'm so glad that you read that quote from the end of our interview with her, because when she said, "I can say these things because I'm respected in my community," I was like, I think we all maybe looked at each other and were like, that's Señora power. Like, that's it. That is just just as concrete and clear and core as it can be to what we're looking for, and what we are like just so excited by is that she has used her position in the community to get respect, and to shift that respect towards the mobilization that aligns with her values. And I think that we've been tracking our señoras almost along a spectrum of respectability, right? This is something we've defined over and over again, but this idea that if you present yourself as respectable in terms of what the dominant society views as the appearance, the talk, the walk of respectable people, kind of like how she did to get to sneak into this like city council meeting, right? Like, she dressed up in a certain way. She pretended to be this person that's very respectable to get in there. And then if this is a spectrum that we're looking at, she is on such a far end where she rejects it. She sees that it's ultimately like a survival strategy, yes, but not going to actually be a means to ending capitalistic sort of devaluation of lives and of environments, of climates. It's not going to end anti-imperialist sort of work that is actively happening, that the U.S. is actively doing on our own behalf of the U.S., but also on behalf of other countries like Israel, right? And I think that I was really just amazed by her being so ahead of the of it myself. Like, I am learning so much about the genocide happening in Palestine, and she was doing this in the 80s, you know? I mean, it's just, I'm in awe, I think, of the work that she has done and continues to do, and the way that she sort of preempted the colonization that we now see explicitly acknowledged by Israel is, I think, clever, and it's her work that she's doing that is like liberation forward kind of work. And I also thought that it was to think again about how she was kind of ahead of where even other people were. So she said this in October. In November 2024, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and also the Minister of Defense of Israel. So literally she's telling us this, and then a month later, the International Criminal Court is like, yeah, they're war criminals. They need to be arrested. And it's only gotten worse since then. So that's just my first instinct, is that she has utilized Señora power strategies in its most concrete, clear form for liberation in every way possible.
We have so much to learn from the people who came before us. That, you know, we as individuals, like us three, are learning through doing this project. And I think with Yolanda, when you look at her survival strategies, I think, yes, there's a part of that where it's like, oh, I'm going to sneak in under the guise of respectability. But there's also the part where she's like, I know who I am. And so the guise of respectability will only ever be a disguise. And I think that's something that we see a lot with Señoras, of like over and over again. It's like, if you are going to use respectability as a tool to survive, which most people have to do if they're in minoritized communities, then you have to know who you are and what you're fighting for. Because if not, then like you may, like, your body may not die, but your soul may die, right? And I think that sounds really dramatic, but you can see it with Yolanda really well, that no matter what happened in her multiple arrests, in like the multiple times it was proved to her that people were surveilling her, like, she kept going with her purpose, with what she was doing, with the way that she tangibly makes her community better. And that agenda that she has to make her community better is actually what saved her from people being violent to her when she had different opinions than them. I think that's something really important to note in this current moment, that Yolanda also lives in this current moment, and that it's a very polarized moment, that you can say something and someone can disagree with you, and that could be a dangerous situation for you. In some ways, this is similar to what a lot of our señoras lived in the 60s and 70s. So, you know, we like to say that everything is new, but actually it's not. It's cyclical. But at the same time, right now, we are living a moment where you have so much information all the time. Like, you know what's happening and what's going wrong in the world all the time. And so I think that it can be very discouraging. But I think Yolanda is someone to learn from when she's really tangibly looking around at her community. Like, she knows her neighbors' names. Like, they know who she is because she's affecting real change. Like, I think listening and to her describe her efforts of like beach cleaning, of you know, of like free ESL classes. I think about like, oh, if I thought about this, I'd be like second guessing myself, or like, oh, am I the right person to do this? Or like, maybe someone else is doing it better already, and stuff like that. And to some extent, like, okay, maybe. But at the same time, Yolanda's like, just do it. Just do it, right? Like, and how many of us don't actually do things because we're like, oh, maybe this isn't necessary, maybe this is necessary. But in the end, like, the revolutionary part is that she's like, I'm going to go out and try to make my community better. And if it's something else they need, then I'll do that, right? And so in the end, that's what saves her, not only like herself, but also like her legacy, like the way that she is, you know, radical in this world and the way she's made everything better.
Okay, well, thank you, listeners, so much for hearing Yolanda's story. We hope that you are inspired. We hope that you take on those different kinds of roles of advocating for your community for free. Thank you so much. This has been another episode of Señora Power. We'll see you soon.